Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Artlist webinar series. My name is Richard Roberts, Solutions Architect here at Artlist. Thank you all for joining us today for our From 0 to 110 Achieving Complete CMMC Compliance on Any Budget. Today I'm joined by Artlist President Michael Speca. He will be discussing how you can achieve certification on your budget. At any time during this webinar, please feel free to submit your questions. They will be addressed during the Q&A session of the webinar. So please note as well that if we don't get to your question during today's session, an Artlist representative will reach out to you shortly after and answer your question directly with you. The webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you at a later date. And then if you have a question after today's webinar session has completed, please email that question to marketing@artlist.com. Now, without further ado, let's get started. Michael, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. Like Rich said, my name is Michael Speca. I'm president. Here at Artlist, we've been working on helping customers get CMMC compliant since before the first version of this came out about 4 years ago. Along the way, we've learned a lot about different approaches that companies have taken. So for probably about the first half of this presentation, we want to talk about what we've learned, what we've seen other people try, what customers of ours have tried maybe previously before coming to work with us, and then also what we've learned along the way. And then we'll talk a little bit about our solution, Tesseract. I know what we've got in the recorded intro or the canned introduction about questions being at the end. I prefer for these things to be as conversational as possible. So if you do have questions, feel free to post them in the chat at any time, and we'll do our best to address them right away. All right, so just diving in a little bit, I think, about kind of the nature of cybersecurity programs in and of themselves. So CMMC, right, it is an enforcement mechanism for an old regulation, DFARS 252-2047E12. That regulation was put into place back in 2017 for DoD suppliers, right? So suppliers that handle defense data that's considered controlled unclassified information. CUI is not just a DoD specification. If you haven't really looked into kind of the background of CUI, it's actually an aggregation of lots of different controlled data types throughout the entire federal government. DoD is the first to really be putting together an enforcement mechanism to ensure that companies are meeting the control standard that they want for that data. So that control standard, as most of you I'm sure know, is NIST 800-171 R2. It contains 110 controls, some 320 assessment objectives to determine if you're meeting those controls. And those controls add up to what we refer to as a cybersecurity program. And that cybersecurity program is designed to do a couple of different things, right? But between making sure as an organization you understand how it is that you're handling sensitive information, how you're receiving it, how you're storing it, how you're processing it, if you do have to send it other places, how you transfer it out of the organization. Making sure that you have both technical and non-technical controls in place to ensure that you're doing the right things with that data. And then monitoring, right? Keeping an eye out for both external and internal threats, and also paying attention to how well your controls are working. So those three things, governance of your cybersecurity program, knowing what you want to do, doing it, hardening your environment, both your digital environment and your process environment, to protect that data, and then defending that data. And those three things are what we add up into a cybersecurity program. So CMMC is part of a change we're seeing in the cybersecurity industry, really across supply chains, not just DoD supply chains, where organizations want to know that their suppliers have solid approaches to protecting data, right? The idea is you don't want to be in a situation where if one of your suppliers gets sick, you get sick. or even if one of your customers runs into trouble, that trouble makes its way back into your organization. So not just the DoD, but across a lot of different industries. Previously, we focused on attestation, right? As an industry, we said, tell the underwriters, that you do stuff. Sign a contract that says that you do stuff. Provide representations and certifications to the government that you do stuff. When I say do stuff, I mean, implemented security controls. So you attest to it. And the consequences of having a problem were all punitive, right? If you turns out that you didn't do the right things, your insurance claims didn't get paid, you had to have a legal settlement. When poor cybersecurity posture was discovered, when you had a breach, right? When you had a data loss, it's not a good approach, right? It doesn't work. And it doesn't work for a couple of reasons, not the least of which is that it's a whole lot easier to attest to something than it is to be assessed, right? Assessment drives a standard of what it really takes to provide an effective way to meet controls. But the other problem with it is this: it encourages the hiding of information, right? Don't really tell people what you're doing. Don't really tell people if you have a problem. Don't really tell people what you're seeing and the steps that you're taking to prevent problems and how effective those steps are. And that doesn't really take into account the fact that we're in an adversarial situation. This isn't about trying to mitigate risk from things like natural disasters. This is about trying to mitigate risk from human activity. And adversaries are good. They wouldn't do what they were doing if it didn't work. And so the defensive posture isn't always 100% effective. Breaches are going to happen, and we can't be in an environment where the consequence of a breach is entirely punitive. And so now we're all encouraged to keep breaches under wraps as much as possible. Right? We need a different way to manage telling each other, how we're doing in protecting data. So this new approach is an assurance approach, right? How do I tell you, or how do you tell the DoD in this case, that you're doing the right things with their data? So we go from asking questions and looking for attestment to requiring a third-party verification. And we also, you hear about things like zero trust and assume breach. We also expect adversaries to be occasionally successful, right? So we want a third-party review of practices to say, yes, indeed, you're doing what's expected as a supplier. And then we want a third-party review like ISO 27001, or, in the case of DoD, CMMC. We've also been seeing an uptick in organizations requiring SOC 2 compliance for in commercial environments to demonstrate that you're implementing security controls in a proper way. So bottom line, having a security program in place, it's an advantage, and it's not just an advantage for government. We do talk to companies who are saying, well, I'm really considering exiting the government business because 10%, 20%, 30% of our business is focused on government, and the increased costs of managing a cybersecurity program that the government's requiring, I can't justify that for that small portion of the business. While that might be a prudent decision in the short term, I think it's a really risky one in the long term, because we are seeing in our commercial customers organizations that are getting very similar requirements from the customers they serve. And in many cases, those questionnaires that come from commercial organizations are now starting with, if you are SOC 2 compliant, if you are ISO 27001 compliant, if you have some third-party certification, you don't have to answer the rest of this questionnaire, just provide us the information on your compliance. So basically what they're saying is, if you have an assurance program in place already, we don't need you to answer our very long questionnaire about the security practices you have in place. Also, those security questionnaires look an awful lot like NIST 800-171. So I think in terms of putting a program in place, this is something that you can get recognized, right? If you get a CMMC certification, if you get an ISO certification, if you get a SOC 2 certification, and having that, at least in today's market, today's environment, is going to be a competitive advantage when you're bidding on contracts, DoD or not. Of course, over time, as everybody catches up, this is going to turn into table stakes. But for today, it's definitely something that you could put in place and tout as something that maybe your competitors don't have. So I guess if anybody has any questions about kind of the concept of a cybersecurity program and why we would want to have one, DoD or not, we can pop those in the chat. Otherwise, I'll jump ahead to thinking about how to get a cybersecurity program in place. Again, CMMC or not, but we're focusing on CMMC today in a budget-friendly way. So first of all, what level do you want to achieve, right? If you handle CUI, you have to be level 2. If you only handle federal contracting information, you can be level 1, and level 1 does allow for self-attestation. I would expect to see, potentially an increase in enforcement activities if you're doing a level 1 attestation and you have a problem, right? So going back to that assurance model, I would want to be able to be pretty confident that I could demonstrate that I'm meeting the level 1 requirements if I'm attesting that I am, as opposed to being on the punitive model where, I'm kind of hush-hush about it. I don't really necessarily do my due diligence, and then I worry about getting in trouble if I have a problem. You can, if you're not worried about handling CUI today, or if your contracts and your contracting officers are telling you that you're not going to be on the leading edge of needing CMMC certification, that's something we see. We have customers who are saying, my contracting officer is telling me I have to have this now. My prime is telling me that I have to have this now. We also talk to people who say, so far we've asked and our primes or our customers are saying, someday think about it, but it's not coming tomorrow. It's not coming. We're not going to be on the leading edge of this. So that leads into level 2. Do I want to take multiple steps or implement it all at once? I would recommend that you don't wait until the last minute, like anything in life. There are approaches to getting into a compliant environment today. Perhaps that's a limited compliant environment that you only use for sales, right? For receiving CUI, that's part of being able to respond to proposals. Or you have a very limited environment that's only for a small set of communications of CUI, but the rest of your organization doesn't need to be in a compliant environment. So figuring out the steps that you want to take, what portions of my business need to be CMMC compliant. Is level 1 good enough for today? Do I need to go to level 2? When do I want to go to level 2? And then for those of you who do work on very sensitive programs, there's a level 3 that's coming, and do we want to be at level 2 as soon as possible? So when the level 3 assessment objectives are released, we can move to implement level 3 as soon as we can. Understanding the systems and data that you need to protect, so understanding the scope. And this really is a big budget impact, because for plenty of organizations, it doesn't have to be everything and everyone all the time, right? It can be certain manufacturing lines, it can be certain contracts, it can be certain segments of my workforce, it can be certain offices. It doesn't have to be everybody all at once. And if you can move away from everybody all at once, then you can incur the costs that you need to put a cybersecurity program together, just specifically tied to the resources that are going to generate revenues that are going to require that cybersecurity program. You want to do that in a way where you can build from there, obviously, but it is possible to put something smaller in place from a scope perspective, in addition to a near-term goal perspective. Step 4 is to assess your technology, and step 5 is to assess your resources. And a quick word about technology, and we'll talk about this, in a little bit more detail on this slide. When CMMC was first announced 4 years ago, the general wisdom the conventional wisdom, is what's shown on the lower right of this slide. And we've provided these services in the past. We moved away from them pretty early on, and I'll explain why in a second. But the conventional wisdom is perform an analysis of your current networks, identify gaps, put together a remediation plan, and then implement the remediation plan. And that's how you get from a non-compliant environment to a compliant environment. There's a couple of really big risks with that approach. First of all, getting compliant and staying compliant are two really different things. So if you think about your cybersecurity program only as that middle pillar that we talked about at the beginning, only as those hardening services, you can put a project together that says, well, I need to implement multi-factor authentication. I need to make sure I have a SIM installed that's gathering telemetry about my environment. I need to put in place a password policy. Maybe I don't let people use USB drives anymore. So you can make some system changes. That's only a fraction of what you need to do in order to be compliant, for one. And two, there's a lot of things that you have to do on a regular basis, right? You have to reassess your business risks at least annually. You have to provide monitoring on, a daily basis. We need to be remediating vulnerabilities regularly. So putting in place a set of hardening controls today doesn't necessarily mean that you're compliant tomorrow. And in fact, as we've gone through the past 4 years, one of the things that is starting to happen now, especially with the rule being so close to being implemented, is we're talking to firms that say, well, 2 years ago, I went through a remediation project, but I couldn't tell you if I'm compliant today. I don't really know where we're at. I don't really know that we've done anything since we've done that project. The second challenge that we run into with the gap analysis remediation plan approach for a lot of our smaller customers, and smaller companies that we talk to, is they spend their budget on the gap analysis. And what we discovered very early on 4 years ago is we'd perform these gap analyses, and at the end of the day, every remediation plan was the fastest and least expensive way to get into a compliant environment is to sunset your on-premises resources and go to the cloud. So if we go back to that, think about your technology, a cloud migration or a migration from a commercial uncontrolled cloud into a controlled cloud like Microsoft GCC High is the answer to the remediation plan, again, for many small companies. And so spending a budget to measure in detail why your current environment isn't compliant when the end result of that assessment is just to implement a new compliant environment and migrate into it, really means that you're spending money on analysis that you could be spending on remediation. So in very rare instances where we're talking to a customer that has a very large and complex environment, very large enterprise, our enterprise services teams will perform a gap analysis. We haven't done one in a long time because the small and mid-sized companies, the majority of the defense industrial base, really, the gap analysis isn't worth, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. And so in a lot of cases, we recommend, especially if you have an aging infrastructure or it's not particularly complex data environment that you're working in, skip the analysis and just go to the plan. And so, that's the managed service, and that's the service of ours that we'll be talking about in the back half of this presentation. There is a risk to doing nothing, although people continue to do it. I think we're at the point where you're putting yourself at a disadvantage in terms of being able to be ready on time. The latest communication from the Cyber AB is that the CMMC regulations are pretty much out of rulemaking. They're ready to be published. There's a congressional review that's backwards looking that nobody expects to see as a repeal of the rule. We've gone through 2 different administrations, right? A Democratic and a Republican administration. The program has bipartisan support, so it looks like it's going to handle. It's going to happen, and I would get started. Again, going back to earlier questions of, what are your near-term goals? How much of your company, right? Those are all things that we can address in order to minimize spend today, right? Keep budget small today. If there isn't an immediate need to get your entire organization into a compliant environment. But getting started so that, when you need to grow your enclave, you're ready to do that is probably the move that I would recommend for just about anybody at this point. You could build an internal team. And in fact, we do recommend that all of our customers have somebody internally that, makes it their business to understand how this cybersecurity program concept works. Because you really want, wherever possible, your cybersecurity program to align with your business. There are solutions out there that say, put your data in our environment, change the way you do business. And the only time I would recommend making a change to how you do business is if making that change reduces friction in your organization operating environment and reduces cost, right? Otherwise, why would you want to, be forced to create a change management project inside your company if you don't have to, just to be able to check a box and say you're compliant? The program, the cybersecurity program, should follow the business mission. And that is one value of having internal resources, is people who are cognizant of that mission and look out for that mission. The trouble is that it's high cost, right? One expert isn't going to do it. The program itself can be time consuming to execute. It's difficult to find experts. Those experts need career paths, right? So if you hire a security operator that's performing security event monitoring and security event investigation, they're going to want to be learning from people who are, more senior than them. They're going to want to know that there's a promotion path, the ability to manage a team, the ability to do more sophisticated work. And so keeping those experts, finding and keeping those experts is difficult. And it's simply just not a one-person operation for most organizations, even single person or under 10-person companies. We support because we can have one of our experts take a portion of their time to monitor their environment, whereas having that resource in-house, they wouldn't necessarily have anything to do the rest of the day. And getting all the skills that you would need in one individual, even if they have the time to perform all the tasks, would be pretty cost prohibitive. So, through that experience, we've really invested a lot of our own resources into building out the technology behind our managed service offering, because for small and mid-sized companies, it seems to be the best bang for your buck in terms of getting a solution in place. So we want to just take a minute here to stress the importance of thinking about this as beyond a tool set. So we do talk to companies who say, well, I bought all this stuff, right? I was told I needed a SIM, so I bought a SIM. I was told I needed an MDR, so I bought an MDR. I got a phishing simulator. I bought some policy templates, but now I have this pile of stuff and I don't know what to do with it. And I think that's where thinking about compliance not as a project, but as an ongoing way to perform and operate your business. So this concept of a cybersecurity program is really important. That involves performing a business risk analysis, so identifying, again, where's the data, right? If we're trying to protect CUI, where's the data? If we're going to spend the money on protecting data, what data of ours do we want to protect, right? Because it's not just a matter of protecting the government data. That's what you need to do in order to be compliant. But with this investment, you want to be protecting your own intellectual property as well. Owning the tools is one thing, using the tools is a totally different thing, right? So how are we monitoring? How are we training? How are we making sure that things are integrated? After we've implemented the technology, how are we administering it? So how do we keep things up to date? And then this concept of program governance, how are we regularly assessing the effectiveness of what we're doing? So all of these things are things that you need to consider. You actually don't have to spend a ton of money on tools. I mean, obviously the tools are more expensive than tools that don't have any security, capability built into them. Our service is built entirely on the Microsoft stack, and we can do 80–90% of what we need to do for you on top of those Microsoft tools. You don't need a lot of different products. Now, if you have a very complex security environment, if you're thinking about level 3 certification, for example, putting some more defense in depth strategies in place that would rely on multiple tool sets is a good thing to do. But to meet at least non-specified basic CUI requirements, stacking up a bunch of tools and then trying to figure out how to integrate them can be putting a lot of money in the wrong place, when you could buy a single integrated product. If you're not a Microsoft fan, Amazon has a cloud, Google has a cloud. There are ways to get this done that don't necessarily involve the Microsoft stack. We find the Microsoft stack to be the most integrated solution out there, and so we think in terms of total cost of ownership, it's the most affordable one. Next thing you got to consider is change. And I mentioned this earlier on when we were talking about the difference between getting in compliant and staying compliant. And so we've identified and we programmatically address in our TestRite program 6 sources of change. If you're working for us or working with us, these are things that will, if we're working for you, these are things that we'll take into consideration as part of our program. As you're looking for the best way for your organization to solve this problem, I would recommend you consider these changes when you're thinking about the ongoing cost of maintaining your compliance. And the biggest of which is that you're going to want to do different things in the next 3 years than you necessarily do today. You might win new contracts, you might decide to enter new lines of business, you might develop new intellectual property, you might open new locations. When you make changes, you don't want to realize when you sit down to be assessed 2 years later that your cybersecurity program has been ineffective because you haven't considered how your operating environment has changed. Your vendors are going to change too, or they should, right? And so here, we talk about us changing as a provider. Whether we're your provider or somebody else is, or you have an internal staff, they need to stay on top of changes in best practices for cybersecurity programs. For example, just this last week, there was a published change, I believe, in NIST's recommendations for password policies. The password, the recommendation for password policy just really recognized that when you make passwords very complex, it doesn't necessarily make them harder to crack. It just makes them harder to remember. And so that means somebody writes them down on a sticky note, puts them on their monitor, and now it's really easy for someone, an insider, to compromise that account. So the new requirements or the new recommendations focus on password length, which does matter in terms of the ability of a brute force attack to break the password, but keeps it easier for people to remember. When you pair that with multi-factor authentication, you have a much more secure identity environment than a short password with lots of special characters in it that's very hard to remember. So that's an example, right? These things happen all the time where best practices change, and you want to make sure that your provider and your internal experts are staying on top of those best practices. Regulatory changes, right? So CMMC, for an example, is frozen on 800.171.R2, but 800.171.R3 is out there. It's going to be the standard at a certain point. It adds controls, and you're going to want to make sure that you're ready to implement those things because there are things you're going to need to have in place. Obviously, it's not just your immediate cybersecurity provider or your internal staff that's going to be changing. Microsoft's changing, Google's changing, Amazon's changing. People, these vendors put new capabilities into their tools all the time, and you need to be in a position to implement those changes when they come out and stay current with the latest technology. And then for the last two here, unfortunately, the adversary gets a vote. They get it in two ways. One, you're never going to have systems that have no vulnerabilities. Researchers discover these every day. The most basic element of dealing with these vulnerabilities is a control in 800.171. It's your patching program, but not every vulnerability can be patched. One, some of them are just so embedded in systems that it's difficult to produce a patch. Staying on top of all the patches is time consuming. And, in many cases, especially for the manufacturers out there, compatibility creates problems. So systems go out of life cycle. They're not getting patches. You might have a very expensive piece of equipment that still relies on an older set of technology that has vulnerabilities in it. And so now how are we going to rearrange the environment to minimize the risk that vulnerability puts into place? And then, of course, the other, the other set of adversary activity comes from new threats. So adversaries are evolving just like everybody else. Excuse me. And so, regulatory changes typically follow by, some would argue, too long of a period of the development of new threat activity. But inside those standards, like 800.171, there's usually a control that basically says keep up with the news and adapt to new threats. And so that's something you should be doing on a regular basis as well. All right, so I'm going to pause again just to see if there's any questions that are up in the chat, and then we'll go ahead and shift to talking a little bit about our approach.
Michael, there is one question that we can get answered here. Question in the chat is, can we still use our existing IT infrastructure while pursuing CMMC compliance?
You can. I mean, you can. It depends on how close that infrastructure is to compliance. And this gets back to that question of the value of the assessment, right? The value of that gap analysis, I should say. So if that IT infrastructure that you have is expensive, it's complicated, and you've put a lot of money and time into getting it, very finely tuned for your company, figuring out where the gaps are in that infrastructure and remediating those gaps could be a very cost-effective way to solve your compliance needs and to get your cybersecurity program in place. Again, the challenge that we've seen is a lot of times that's not the case, right? It's old. We haven't upgraded in a long time. The operating systems are old. The productivity and collaboration environment is really dated, so we're not taking advantage of new technologies or newer technologies like the kind of chat and collaboration functions you would expect out of Microsoft Teams or a Slack type solution. So these infrastructures are old, and it'll be very expensive to get them up to a compliant environment. And in doing so, you won't get productivity improvements that you would get out of upgrading your entire productivity environment, which is why a lot of the companies that we've talked to over the years have really just opted to go to the cloud. They've moved to the Microsoft cloud and a sovereign cloud, right? So it meets the U.S. person's requirements for data storage and data handling, and that winds up being the best path. And so what I'd encourage you to do is consider really, how much investment you've made in keeping that environment up to date before you go ahead and spend the money on a gap analysis. Because if the gap analysis comes back and says, essentially replace the whole thing, then you spend $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 getting to a point that you really didn't need to spend the money to understand. So, but perhaps there's an opportunity to do an initial analysis of your current environment. Some providers like us will perform, not a full gap analysis, but an analysis of your current operation so that we can design the new solution for you, and in doing so would be able to tell you what you have is actually really good and you don't need to replace it, or you have very little work to do to replace it. And so we wouldn't recommend moving to a cloud environment necessarily. And we do that as a pre-sales getting to know you activity. It's not something that you would have to pay for, and I'm sure we're not alone in performing that kind of analysis as a pre-sales engineering activity. So, we'd love to just talk to you a bit more about what you have and see if it makes sense. And if it is newer and there's a lot of sophistication, then then we'd recommend a different approach. The other place that we see this, what do we do about our existing infrastructure, is on manufacturing floors, and sometimes in development and lab environments where, again, I had mentioned if you've got a lot of investment in the current environment, there might be it might be a good use of your budget to preserve that environment. And so we take that into consideration when we're designing solutions, even if we're moving a portion of the environment to the cloud. Rearranging a manufacturing floor, upgrading manufacturing equipment is an entirely different spend potentially than just shifting some information technology resources from old on-premises stuff to the cloud. So that would be another place that you'd want to take a closer look. I hope that addressed the question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. Is there a follow-up there or anything else we would want to touch on?
There is one on which you answered, which is how does Microsoft GCC High support the CMMC compliance?
Oh, yeah, great question. So, Microsoft GCC High is a fully compliant environment. Excuse me. Obviously, there's configuration and operation that you have to do in that environment. But the GCC High environment meets the requirements in a couple of different ways. It's a sovereign cloud, so Microsoft doesn't put data outside of the country. There's also a U.S. persons requirement for CUI that you may already be aware of. So you have to be a green card holder or a citizen to handle many types of CUI, I think maybe even all types of CUI. And Microsoft will guarantee that throughout the entirety of the GCC High operation, that there's no non-US persons that provide support or handle data. People often ask about GCC, the government cloud, and the difference between that and GCC High, and one of those differences is the US persons requirement. Microsoft will also accept the flow down of 7012, and then when it comes out, 7019 through 7021. So from a contractual standpoint, GCC High is the environment you would need to be in if you wanted to, essentially be able to communicate back to the government that yes, your third-party provider is willing to accept the contract terms that you're getting for the protection of CUI. Microsoft publishes, we're part of their CMMC acceleration group, and they publish a whole placemat where you can go put, any control in there, any assessment objective, and it'll tell you specifically, what features of the GCC High environment are specifically designed to meet those requirements, and how you, as a user of that environment, what would be your responsibility in terms of how you configure those features. So they've got a very, very thorough answer to that question. And if you follow up with us after the webinar, we can help point you to those resources. They have an entire system security plan and really the whole nine.
Great. There is one more question, Michael, a follow-up somewhat to that, which is it easier to build off what the company currently has in place for a company to staff everything, or for a company to staff everything from scratch? So use what you have currently in place, or start off with everything from scratch. They're asking for this because they're looking to pull away from their current situation and want to know what the best way to go forward is.
Sure. So let me give you a general answer to that, and then I'll talk specifically about how we would go about helping you. I would say there's obviously two extremes to that answer. We already talked about if I have a really good, level of investment in my current environment, and it's very efficient, and I don't want to lose all of the investment that we've made, I'll recommend if we can just make a minor set of changes to your current environment, let's look at doing that. There's a lot of productivity gains to be made by going to the cloud. And so if you're not in the cloud, it's usually worth thinking about those productivity gains. Generally mean that you can support far more use cases in terms of effective travel, working from home, other situations. I understand a lot of us have used VPNs for a long time. There's a lot of problems with them that go away if you're in the cloud. Boundary protection is another thing that's a big part of 800.171. Where's the edge of my network? And that's an outdated concept, right? Zero Trust says there is no edge to the network. Zero Trust says I'm not gonna trust a system just because it's sitting on the same network as I am. That's one of the tenets of a Zero Trust architecture, and you can get that by going to the cloud as well. So data sharing, collaboration, all that kind of stuff happens way easier in the cloud. There's a lot of physical security that, obviously Microsoft and their providers are performing at data centers that you don't have to do. Pardon me, if you're in the cloud. And then on the other extreme, we talk to companies all the time that, they did a big physical investment in their server environment 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Those leases, not the leases, but the financing for that equipment is all paid for. And so the challenge that they have is they're looking at, well, today, I don't have a very high operating spend for my IT environment. But the problem is that environment is really aging. And so I have stuff that's out of warranty. I have stuff that's out of support. Maybe things that we're not getting new patches put in place for anymore, right? The vendors aren't creating vulnerability remediations, right? They want you to upgrade. Some of that hardware is failing. You got a lot of risk of downtime. And I'd say in almost every single one of those cases that we've looked at over the years, the answer has been, let's sunset all this stuff and move it to a cloud environment where, a lot of those operating costs get folded into your cloud subscription. They're a lot more predictable. Yeah, we might be on the tail end of an investment where we had to spend a lot of money 5 years ago. And it's nice that today we don't have, a big outflow, but when you factor that into your TCO for the system, you're probably pretty close to as good as it's going to get, right? And it's time to look at a new funding model for the infrastructure that you need. And cloud lets you put everything in as an operating expense, right? You don't have to worry about, are any of these things going to be considered depreciable assets that I've gone out and bought. You don't need a big upfront financing to get into the cloud, compared to what you might need to do to get the same capabilities with an on-premises system. Pardon me. And so again, from an Artilus perspective, from a Tesseract perspective, what we do if you decided to work with us, and again, this is no obligation, is we'd want to understand your current operating environment and the technology you had today. One, so we could go back, if I'll leap back to the beginning of this, so we could help work with you to understand, some of the early steps of this roadmap, and figure out, can I use my current environment, let's say, for those 60% of my business that is not DoD, as I'm making plans over the long term to get a broader part of my business into a compliant environment. I really want to get that portions of my business, grow that as the revenues that require, a compliant program grow, and not spend that cost on processes or personnel that are capturing revenue that doesn't require the services. And then, in order to answer, questions 3 and 4 and design a cost-effective approach, we need to look at what you have. So in terms of getting an answer of how valuable is what I have today, and how quickly should I be moving away from it, those are things that we can help you assess, again, at no cost. Our mission here is really to make sure that small and mid-sized companies can meet this requirement. Very early on in this process, there were people talking about how there's going to require a massive consolidation of the defense industrial base, and prepare to sell your business to a big prime contractor, and that's 100% unnecessary. And we're here to help you figure out how to do this in an affordable way, and that may involve using some of your existing resources. All right, I think we got time for one more if there's questions now. And if not, I'll dive into the rest of the managed systems approach that we've got. Rich, there.
Go ahead and move forward.
Anything else, though? Is there anything else in the questions?
No, I don't see another question.
Okay. All right. Well, certainly, if you want to dig into more about this issue of, what do I do with what I have today? Should I move away from it? We can do an initial assessment of that at no cost. Don't go out and pay for a gap analysis. If a gap analysis is worth paying for, we'll let you know. All right, so Tesseract, our service, we built this from the ground up for cybersecurity programs. So we call it a cybersecurity program as a service. We try to keep it as simple as possible. So we work with you to design what your program should look like, to get it in place, and then to manage it over time. We've invested in a lot of patent pending technology. We'll talk about that a bit here, to simplify 801.71 implementations to keep it easy for you to understand. Meanwhile, if you do have a lot of expertise around this, we can dive as deeply as you want to into your cybersecurity program, but we can also keep it at a pretty high level. Get everything in place, and then we have the personnel and the expertise to manage that program, reference those 6 sources of change that we talked about earlier, keep everything going over time. And the program's built on the cybersecurity framework. So like I said, we built this from the ground up, specifically focused on operating a cybersecurity program. This isn't an IT service that we then tried to bolt a bunch of security capabilities onto. So we took these cybersecurity framework 1.1 concepts of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, and we've mapped those to this concept of governance, hardening, and defending. So making sure that we identify and evolve our business requirements, protect our systems and recover in the case of an incident or a security event, and then make sure we're doing the work to detect and respond, both adversary activities, so security events, but also, just as importantly, in an ongoing compliance environment, how well are our security controls working? Are we going to pass the next certification? Are the processes that we put in place between your organization and our support working? And that's a big difference between our defense services and what you might see if you're trying to stitch other tools together. You go out and get an MDR service that's really focused on adversary activity. It's not necessarily going to monitor your business processes. So I'll actually skip this slide because that's just a summary of what I just touched on. But for the most part, the takeaway here is we're going to address all of the policy paperwork that you need to have in place. More importantly, we're going to make sure those policies actually represent your business operations. You can go grab templates and try to fill in the blanks. The challenge with that is making sure that the template that you grabbed and the blanks that you filled in actually reflect what it is that you're doing. Because when an assessor shows up and says, let me see your policies, then the next thing that they're going to say is, okay, let's go look at how you execute these policies. And if there's a gap between those two things, you're not going to pass. The hardened services are all the required controls around security architecture, system baselines, system change management, vulnerability remediation, et cetera. So that's the piece that most people think of as cybersecurity, the locking down of things. And then this defense service, which again is a combination of the other thing that lots of people think about when they think about cybersecurity, which is detection and response, looking out for adversary activity and responding to it, looking out for insider threat activity and responding to it. But just as importantly, monitoring the effectiveness of your security controls, so you'll pass an assessment today, 3 years from now when you need to get reassessed, you'll be able to communicate that you've been doing all the right things over the 3 years between assessments. Budget-wise, there's a lot of different ways that you can engage with us. And part of our complementary analysis of your business addresses understanding what tools you need to be compliant. And this is how we can say, hey, look, it's only 20% of the business. It's only 20% of the workforce. It's only this office. It's only this manufacturing line. It's only this lab. We don't need necessarily today to get the entire organization into a compliant environment. And then even when we do, there's different levels of investment that are necessary for those personnel or those systems. So we've got 3 different program levels for folks who are just looking to be able to confidently self-attest that they're level 1. We have our foundational service for people who want to get rolling, but they're still hesitant to make the full investment until they know for sure that the rules are going into their contracts. We have what we call advanced start. This gives you more controls and makes sure you have all the documentation in place that you would need, but maybe we haven't implemented everything yet. So it's a mix between the CMMC level 1 requirements and then a lot of the paperwork and planning that you need to have in place for your level 2 environment. And then some of the basic controls that really every organization needs to have that aren't really dependent on your business. Advanced complete, we're going to get you a CMMC level 2, and we're going to do it in a way where you're choosing different approaches that match your risk tolerance and your business needs. And so people sometimes say, well, like, what does that even mean? You know, how are we different than somebody else? Our very first 2 CMMC customers 4 years ago, and keep in mind, you know, we're still dealing with the pandemic at this time. One was a manufacturing company that had a campus in Vienna. We still work with them, has a campus in Vienna, I should say. And their number 1 concern is, how do I get everybody back into the building? Because everything's locked down. We don't allow people to work from home. Our people don't need to travel. All of our IP is in our office or on our manufacturing floor. They actually didn't even allow corporate wireless. They didn't see any need for their data to be going through the sky. They wanted you to sit down to a terminal that was plugged in somewhere in their building if you were going to access data. The other one did work for the Navy, and they did it all over the world. They were actually making the decision to shut down their offices and have everybody telework from home or from client locations. So their questions were all about, how do I get secure access to data no matter where I am? And so you can imagine that the approaches to meeting those 110 controls were very different for those 2 organizations. What we've done, and we'll talk about it, I think in the next slide or 2, is develop some patent pending ways for us to be able to provide those 2 very, very different experiences at the same price. Service levels, core is our most basic service level. That's where we're going to provide all of the know-how to be compliant. We're going to provide the security operations to be compliant, the virtual CISO to help you with your policy generation. Well, really to generate your policies for you based on the business decisions that you make. Those hardening security administrators, the security baselines, and then the security operators. Plus and premium add 2 different levels of IT support. If you've got an IT team internally that you love, we can work with them. If you have a managed service provider that does IT but doesn't do security that you love, we can work with them. We simply, work with you to generate the tickets to perform the IT actions that need to be performed to stay compliant, and then also make sure that the processes that you're using for those IT activities are operating in a compliant fashion. So 3 different levels of investment, depending on what you've already got in terms of effective IT resources. If you don't have any, or those resources are overwhelmed, we can certainly do that for you as well. Third place we give you some budgetary flexibility is different user types. So some users really need a fully protected endpoint with a lot of local software on there. Developers, engineers, people who are working in CAD, designers. Those use cases are almost always full users. People who do a lot of really complex analysis, data modeling, things like that. But it's also possible to save money and provide really good experiences with virtual endpoints that are in the cloud. Those are easier to secure, right? Because we're not having to deal with a laptop that's moving about the world and making sure we're protecting that laptop. Everything that we're protecting is in the cloud. And an even simpler implementation of that is a web-only experience where not only do we not need a full endpoint that's physical, right? In the cloud user, we take that full endpoint, we move it to the cloud. But I don't need a full endpoint at all, right? I need to be able to read PDFs. I need to be able to do some basic analysis using Excel online, or I need to modify some documents using Word online. If all of the tooling that you use, maybe my ERP system is already hosted in the FedRAMP environment, so I don't need a laptop anymore, right? I just need my mobile device and to be able to do some web experiences that can be even less expensive. So by balancing your program and your service level and the user types within your service level, we've been able to save customers a lot of money in terms of their approach to what their program is going to look like. So we're just about out of time. I just want to very quickly touch on this patent pending technology that we've designed. This is how we keep things simple for you, as we've basically taken all of the elements of a cybersecurity program and we've broken them down into their little constituent pieces, and then we've reassembled them into blocks. And what the blocks allow us to do is tune the program to your requirements in a way that is very, very tailored to your business. But for us, the experience that we have supporting the organization that wants to do everything inside their facility in Vienna and the organization that needs to be anywhere in the world, that looks the same to our engineers, to our support staff, to our virtual CISOs. And so we can provide the same kind of economy of scale that a more cookie cutter managed service might be able to do while providing you the kind of custom environment that you might expect from a more expensive consulting style engagement. So for those of you who are asking about your current investments, it is possible to maintain the specificity of what you've done for your business. You don't have to move to our way of doing things or another security vendor's way of doing things. We put a lot of work into this this approach that allows us to be flexible, and we think it's very effective in helping organizations continue to maintain their competitive differentiation in the way they like to work while still being compliant. Very quickly, and if you've got the recording of this, you can take a deeper look at this picture. Tesseract is a comprehensive approach. There isn't a control that we don't work with you on. Even things like physical security, where we might not be the vendor of the physical security tools, we're certainly not going to be flying out and installing locks on your office doors or your server room doors or things like that. But making sure that you're doing the right things, writing the language for your policies and your system security plan and all that kind of stuff, consulting with you on what the right approach is to any particular portion of your system is something that we're going to perform with you. We also have a couple of guarantees that I think are worth noting. First of all, we have a remediation guarantee. So one of the great values of our blocks is if someone gets assessed and they don't pass for some reason, that block turns out not to be effective, we're going to update everybody's block. And we're going to update that for you if you're the one who went through the assessment at no additional cost. We also have an affordability guarantee. There's a lot of people in this space right now. What we've learned participating in this market is there's a handful of vendors that take it as seriously as we do, but pricing is also all over the map, and we never want you to think we're the best solution for your business and then find out that because we're 10, 20, 30% more expensive than somebody else, you can't get board approval or CEO approval to choose us. Instead, you're going to get told to go with the lowest price option. And so if someone's doing the same thing we're doing, or a similar thing to what we're doing at a better price, we're going to go ahead and match that price. Again, we're all about the ongoing compliance experience. Whether you're working with us or anybody else, that is your biggest cost. So when you're thinking about your ongoing budget, try not to narrow in on just that initial gap analysis and the project to implement security controls. Really look at the breadth of how are we going to maintain these controls over the 3 years between assessments and make sure that we're continuing to do the same, the right things throughout, every day, every week, every month, and how are we going to handle changes when they come? Because that's where we've seen over the last 3 years people really get bitten cost-wise. If you want any help looking at your current environment, making a decision about the best way to go, even if you decide that Tesseract isn't the right answer, we're certainly happy to help you figure that out. We want to make sure the entire defense industrial base succeeds in getting these very important controls in place, and that small and mid-sized companies can continue to thrive in this environment. You don't have to compromise your business or move out of government contracting just because of these requirements. There's definitely ways to get them done in stages that are affordable, and we'd love to get a chance to help you figure that out. So I think I'm out of time. If anybody wants to stick around and there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And if not, if you have more questions or would love our help, we'd love to hear from you. Rich, I'll give it back to you.
Thanks, Michael. Looks like we do have one question here from one of the participants. It says, what if I'm currently working with an MSP? What questions should I ask them to know if they are able to cover me with CMMC?
Sure. So current MSPs, and we actually have another presentation that we did in our video series that was about selecting tools. We can get you the link to that. But very quickly, obviously, we've been in a lot of competitive situations over the last 4 years. We've had a chance to learn about what a good competitor looks like, and unfortunately, there are some folks out there, a lot of people that want to stick CMMC on their website but don't necessarily know what that means. So if it's a managed service provider, they should have a shared responsibility matrix. So they should be able to tell you of the assessment objectives that you're going to get measured on when an assessor comes out, which ones are you responsible for making sure are done, and which ones are they responsible for making sure are done. The other thing you're going to want to look at is take a look at that assessment guide. It's available from DoD. We can get the link out to you. NIST 800-171 is broken into, I think it's 17 domains, 110 controls. Some of the more unscrupulous vendors that we've seen out there love to talk about the simple controls, and they won't talk about the hard ones. So ask them to be able to address all of the domains. What do you do for system maintenance? What do you do for policy generation? What do you do for vulnerability management? They should be able to talk to you about all of those domains, even if it's to very fairly tell you, well, this one you're responsible for. So I would say, that's probably the two easiest ways to do it, is ask them for their shared responsibility matrix, and then be able to run through and discuss all of the domains and understand what they provide for you. There's lots of tools and there's lots of providers. And I'm not saying we're the only ones that are comprehensive. There's certainly other providers out there who are. But a lot of people will address portions. They'll say they'll help you with CMMC. That's really putting the onus on you to figure out if you've got everything covered. And so, I would talk to them about that. And then, as I mentioned, we work with customers who already have existing IT service providers. Our core service is all about making sure you have all the right things in place, whether you're responsible for them, your IT service provider is responsible for them, or we're responsible for them. So we can always, be part of your team, helping you get and stay compliant while you're still getting the IT support from either your internal IT team or from an MSP that you know and trust and you think provides good service. We're not out to displace any of those firms. Anything else we need to address, Rich?
I think you just addressed this last one. The question is, we've moved to GCC Cloud and have an external ISP who is comfortable with the technical bits of compliance, but uh, but doesn't want to help with policies,
Sure.
certification support, and et cetera. So what combination of these options would you suggest in this case? Do we fire them and have you do everything else? Question mark.
Sure. I would say that depends on how happy you are with their service and what it is specifically that they're not willing to do. So we do customize these programs. We try to keep everything as simple and clean and easy as possible. But if you've got a provider that's handling things that would normally come with our core program and you don't need them from us, we can certainly work with you to handle those parts of it. That might wind up being outside of a Tesseract program. It might be a custom program because we would need to be writing policies and procedures that, and basically, doing the paperwork that met those approaches. And if those approaches weren't blocks already in Tesseract, then it would be something custom for us to build. But we do add blocks to Tesseract all the time. As I mentioned, we change, the regulatory environment changes, the vendors that we rely on, Microsoft, Enable, right, their tools change. And so writing new blocks is part of what we do. It's part of how we stay on top of things and how we're expecting to be able to provide you service over the life of your program. And so it's possible, depending on what those approaches are, what that ISP is doing for you, that would just be something we'd want to incorporate into the program. So I'd say let's talk and see if there's something we can do there. Alternately, you're looking at contracting a virtual CISO, or there's providers out there that will give you templates for different policies, and then you have to modify the templates. If you choose to go down that path, just remember that stuff's got to be real, right? The assessment guide says, and we have certified assessors on staff, gone through the training. Those assessments say, read the policy, right? Read the documentation, and then go interview staff or examine systems to make sure that those policies and those processes are being followed. So if your SSP says one thing and you're actually doing something else, that's not going to pass. So however you go about making sure you get those policies and that security plan written, make sure that it meets the it meets what you're really doing. So I guess in your case, that provider that you have has to at least be willing to sit down and talk to you and tell you what they do so that you can get it properly documented.
Okay. All right. I think that's the last question we have then. I'd say
Okay,
that concludes our session today. If we didn't get to your question, or if you have a question and you didn't get a chance to present it, please send that follow-up to marketing@ardlist.com. We'll be reaching out to those to answer those questions directly. And then after this webinar, we will be sending out follow-up emails with the webinar recording, as well as other resources that will be helpful for you on the topics that were covered here today. If you're looking for more information on Ardlist and our services, please visit us at www.ardlist.com. Thank you.
Appreciate your questions, everyone. Thanks for attending.